Before his wedding to the daughter of the city's elite, the most powerful mafia boss in the country decided to test his fiancée in a way she never expected. He pretended to fly overseas for a massive deal, but instead he hid inside a secret room within his own mansion just to watch how she treated his sick, helpless mother when she thought the doors were locked. What he saw his perfect bride-to-be do left him paralyzed with a rage he hadn't felt in 17 years. But it was the humble maid's reaction that changed his fate forever. You won't believe the truth he uncovered from behind the glass. The surveillance room was buried deep within the Nari estate, hidden behind a heavy mahogany bookshelf in the library. In the flickering blue light of 12 high-definition monitors, the face of Hosiak Nari, the most feared man in the underworld, was carved into a mask of stone. For years he had sat here to hunt enemies and expand his empire, but today his target was the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with. Hosiak remembered his mother Bora's trembling voice from the night before. She had clutched his hand, her eyes clouded with the fog of her illness, and whispered, "Hosiak, watch her when the lights are off. A snake only sheds its skin when it thinks the garden is empty." He hadn't wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that Esther Chidi was the grace and light his dark life needed. But as he watched the main screen, the front gates of the mansion closed behind his decoy car. On the monitor, Esther was standing by the fountain, waving a tearful goodbye, her hand pressed to her heart as if she were mourning his departure. Then the switch flipped. The moment the gates locked, Esther's grieving face vanished. Her posture straightened into a cold, arrogant line, and she wiped her eyes with a look of pure disgust. She pulled out her phone, and through the hidden speakers, Hosiak heard her voice, sharp, shrill, and stripped of all its sweetness. "The fool is gone," she snapped into the phone. "Finally. Tell the nursing home to have the papers ready by tonight. I'm not spending another second playing nurse to that dying old woman." Hosiak's hand clenched the arm of his leather chair so hard the stitching began to pop. He didn't move. In the world of the mafia, a rushed reaction was a death sentence. He forced himself to stay in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the screen, as Esther turned toward his mother's wing of the house with a wicked smile playing on her lips. He was going to watch. He was going to see everything. And by the time he stepped out of that room, the city would realize that the only thing more dangerous than a mafia boss is a mafia boss who has been betrayed. The morning of the departure was thick with a tension that only Hosiak Nari truly understood. The mansion was a hive of activity, servants scurrying to finish packing the heavy leather suitcases that supposedly contained his wardrobe for a 2-week business intensive in Sicily. Hosiak stood at the top of the grand staircase, adjusted his silk tie, and checked his watch. 10 a.m. In the world of the Nari Syndicate, timing was the difference between a successful hit and a prison sentence. Today, it was the difference between a life of lies and a moment of devastating truth. He descended the stairs, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the marble. Esther was waiting for him at the base, looking like a vision of high society perfection in a tailored cream suit. She looked like the kind of woman a man of his stature was expected to marry. Polished, beautiful, and seemingly devoted. When she saw him, her face lit up with a soft, radiant smile that at once made Hosiak's pulse quicken. Now, as he looked into her eyes, he felt only a cold, clinical detachment. He was looking at her through the lens of his mother's warnings. "Must you really go, Hosiak?" Esther murmured, her voice a melodious pout as she reached out to straighten a collar that was already perfect. 2 weeks is a long time to leave your bride-to-be alone in this big house. I shall miss you terribly." Hosiak caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. He felt the cold hardness of the 10-carat diamond he had placed on her finger 6 months ago. The Sicilians are restless, Esther. They need to be reminded of who keeps the Mediterranean trade routes open. Besides, he added, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble, the sooner I settle this, the sooner we can focus entirely on the wedding. I'll be waiting, she whispered, leaning in to press a lingering kiss against his cheek. She smelled of expensive jasmine and something metallic, the scent of ambition. Hosiak turned toward the garden wing where his mother's rooms were located. He found Bora sitting in her wheelchair by the window, her hands trembling in her lap, a symptom of the Parkinson's that was slowly stealing her vitality. Linda, the maid, was standing quietly nearby, a damp cloth in her hand, having just finished tending to the older woman. When Hosiak entered, Linda stepped back respectfully, her head bowed. He barely spared her a glance, his focus entirely on his mother. He knelt beside the wheelchair, taking Bora's thin, papery hands in his tattooed ones. "I'm leaving for the airport now, Mother," he said softly. Bora's eyes, usually clouded, suddenly sharpened. She leaned forward, her breath hitching as she whispered into his ear, low enough that even Esther, standing in the doorway, couldn't hear. "The camera doesn't lie, my son. Don't look at the face she shows you. Look at the one she wears when the world is dark." Hosiak squeezed her hand once, a silent promise, before standing up. He walked past Esther without another word, his security detail falling in line behind him. He climbed into the back of the black armored SUV, the heavy door closing with a dull thud that sounded like a coffin lid. As the motorcade pulled away from the estate and through the iron gates, Hosiak watched Esther through the tinted glass. She stood on the porch, waving until they were out of sight. 3 miles down the road, the motorcade pulled into a nondescript warehouse owned by the syndicate. Hosiak stepped out of the vehicle and into a waiting, low-profile sedan. 10 minutes later, he was entering his estate through a service tunnel that had been constructed during the Prohibition era, a secret known only to him and his most trusted advisor. He moved through the bowels of the house with the silence of a predator, eventually reaching the library. He pulled a specific leather-bound volume of Dante's Inferno from the shelf, and with a soft hydraulic hiss, the wall swung inward. Hosiak stepped into the dark, chilled air of the surveillance room. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing him in total silence. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, the glow of 12 monitors reflecting in his dark, narrowed eyes. He reached out and tapped a command on the console. On the center screen, the grand hall of the Nari estate appeared. Esther was still there, but she wasn't waving anymore. She was standing in the center of the room, looking at her reflection in a gold-rimmed mirror. She took the silk scarf Hosiak had given her for her birthday, a rare vintage piece, and used it to wipe the spot on her cheek where he had kissed her. With a look of utter loathing, she crumpled the silk into a ball and tossed it into a nearby trash bin. Hosiak sat back, his jaw tightening until the muscle ticked. The ruse was complete. The trap was set. Now he would wait and see exactly what kind of monster he had invited into his home. The silence of the surveillance room was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the servers and the heavy, rhythmic thud of Hosiak's heart against his ribs. On the monitors, the grand foyer of the Nari estate looked like a stage after the lead actor had departed, but the performance was far from over. Esther Chidi stood alone for a moment, her eyes fixed on the front door as if verifying the lock. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, she reached up and tore the pearl necklace from her throat, the very pearls Hosiak had gifted her to mark their engagement. She didn't place them on the table. She tossed them onto the marble floor with a clatter that rang through the speakers in Hosiak's hidden sanctuary. Her face, once a masterpiece of poise and gentleness, contorted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated loathing. She looked toward the stairs, toward the room where her mother, Bora, lay resting, and spat on the floor. "Finally,"
she hissed, her voice no longer the melodic chime Hosak had known, but a jagged blade that cut through the silence. The king of the underworld is gone, and I don't have to smell that hospital stench for one more minute. Hosak's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of his console. He watched as she pulled a second burner phone from a hidden pocket in her designer handbag. Her fingers moved with a practiced, frantic speed. She didn't look like a bride-to-be. She looked like a predator that had finally been let off its leash.
"He's clear," she said into the phone, her voice cold and commanding. "The fool is halfway to the airport. Get here now. We don't have much time before I have to go play loving daughter-in-law to that breathing corpse upstairs." Hosak felt a chill slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning of the secret room. He had spent 17 years navigating the betrayals of the 5 families, survived 3 assassination attempts, and built an empire from the blood-soaked streets of the city. He thought he knew what evil looked like, but seeing it wear the face of the woman he had intended to protect was a different kind of violence. 20 minutes passed. Hosak sat motionless, a ghost in his own house, watching as a silver sedan pulled into the service entrance, a gate that Esther had clearly ensured was left unlocked. A man stepped out, adjusting a designer jacket. Hosak recognized him instantly. Julian Vance, the son of a rival family Hosak had thought was neutralized years ago. Esther didn't wait for him to ring the bell. She threw open the door before he could even reach the porch. The moment Julian stepped inside, the mask didn't just fall, it shattered. Esther threw her arms around his neck, her laughter sharp and mocking as it echoed through the halls of the Nari mansion. "Did he suspect anything?" Julian asked, his hands moving possessively over her waist. "Hosak?" Esther laughed, a high, brittle sound. "He's a brute with a badge of power, Julian. He thinks he's so smart because he can outgun a street gang, but he's blind. He actually thinks I love him. He thinks I'm gonna spend my life changing his mother's bandages and playing the dutiful mafia wife." She pulled back, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying ambition. "He's signing the new power of attorney documents the day we get back from the honeymoon. After that, Bora goes to the cheapest state facility I can find, and Hosak won't be coming home from his next business trip." Julian smiled, leaning in to kiss her in the very spot where Hosak had proposed. "And the maid, the one who's always hovering?" Esther's face darkened with a sneer. "Linda? She's a cockroach. She stays out of the way or I'll crush her along with the old woman. She's lucky I haven't thrown her out in the street already." In the darkness of the secret room, Hosak Nari didn't move. He didn't roar in anger and he didn't rush out to spill their blood on the marble. Instead, he reached out and touched the screen, his finger tracing the line of Esther's throat. A cold, predatory calm settled over him, the kind of calm that preceded the most brutal of his purges. "Show me everything, Esther," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the monitors flicker. "Show me every lie you've ever told, because by the time I'm finished, you'll wish you had stayed a ghost." The shadows in the surveillance room seemed to deepen as Hosak leaned forward, his eyes burning into the center monitor. Julian and Esther had moved from the foyer into the formal living room, pouring themselves glasses of the vintage scotch Hosak kept for high-ranking dignitaries. They sat close together on the velvet sofa, their posture relaxed and predatory, as if they already owned every brick and beam of the Nari estate.
"He's clear," she said into the phone, her voice cold and commanding. "The fool is halfway to the airport. Get here now. We don't have much time before I have to go play loving daughter-in-law to that breathing corpse upstairs." Hosak felt a chill slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning of the secret room. He had spent 17 years navigating the betrayals of the 5 families, survived 3 assassination attempts, and built an empire from the blood-soaked streets of the city. He thought he knew what evil looked like, but seeing it wear the face of the woman he had intended to protect was a different kind of violence. 20 minutes passed. Hosiak sat motionless, a ghost in his own house, watching as a silver sedan pulled into the service entrance, a gate that Esther had clearly ensured was left unlocked. A man stepped out, adjusting a designer jacket. Hosiak recognized him instantly. Julian Vance, the son of a rival family Hosiak had thought was neutralized years ago. Esther didn't wait for him to ring the bell. She threw open the door before he could even reach the porch. The moment Julian stepped inside, the mask didn't just fall, it shattered. Esther threw her arms around his neck, her laughter sharp and mocking as it echoed through the halls of the Nari mansion. "Did he suspect anything?" Julian asked, his hands moving possessively over her waist. "Hosiak," Esther laughed, a high, brittle sound. "He's a brute with a badge of power, Julian. He thinks he's so smart because he can outgun a street gang, but he's blind. He actually thinks I love him. He thinks I'm going to spend my life changing his mother's bandages and playing the dutiful mafia wife." She pulled back, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying ambition. "He's signing the new power of attorney documents the day we get back from the honeymoon. After that, Bora goes to the cheapest state facility I can find, and Hosiak, well, Hosiak won't be coming home from his next business trip." Julian smiled, leaning in to kiss her in the very spot where Hosiak had proposed. "And the maid, the one who's always hovering?" Esther's face darkened with a sneer. "Linda, she's a cockroach. She stays out of the way or I'll crush her along with the old woman. She's lucky I haven't thrown her out in the street already." In the darkness of the secret room, Hosiak Nari didn't move. He didn't roar in anger. He didn't rush out to spill their blood on the marble. Instead, he reached out and touched the screen, his finger tracing the line of Esther's throat. A cold, predatory calm settled over him, the kind of calm that preceded the most brutal of his purges. "Show me everything, Esther," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the monitors flicker. "Show me every lie you've ever told, because by the time I'm finished, you'll wish you had stayed a ghost." The shadows in the surveillance room seemed to deepen as Hosiak leaned forward, his eyes burning into the center monitor. Julian and Esther had moved from the foyer into the formal living room, pouring themselves glasses of the vintage scotch Hosiak kept for high-ranking dignitaries. They sat close together on the velvet sofa, their posture relaxed and predatory, as if they already owned every brick and beam of the Nari estate. "We have to move fast, Julian," Esther said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial hum that the high-sensitivity microphones captured with terrifying clarity. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, spreading a series of legal documents across the coffee table. "I've already had my contact at the clinic draft the preliminary evaluation for Bora. He's willing to sign off on a diagnosis of advanced cognitive decline and paranoia. We just need one more signature." Julian scanned the papers, a slow, dark smile spreading across his face. "Incompetency. It's the cleanest way. If she's declared legally unfit to manage her affairs, and you're the designated guardian in the pre-wedding contract, you'll have total control over the Nari trusts before the first "I do" is even spoken." Hosiak felt a vain pulse in his temple. He had worked for nearly 2 decades to build an empire that could protect his mother, ensuring she would never again experience the poverty and fear of his youth. Now he was watching a woman he had nearly trusted discuss his mother as if she were a nuisance to be disposed of for profit. "And once the assets are transferred?" Julian asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Esther let out a cold, sharp laugh that made the hair on the back of Hosiak's neck stand up. "There's a facility in the industrial district, Sunset Pines. It's a warehouse for the elderly, Julian. No visitors allowed without a strict appointment, and the staff are paid to be forgetful. Once she's there, she won't last 6 months. The stress of the move will be her official cause of death." She leaned in closer, her eyes glittering with a terrifying greed.
Hosek thinks he's so clever with his secret bank accounts and overseas holdings. He doesn't realize that the moment I'm his legal wife, I don't need his permission. I'll have the keys to everything he's built. And since he spends so much time in dangerous territories, it wouldn't be a tragedy if he suffered a fatal accident during his next trip to the docks. A grieving widow, a massive inheritance, and no mother-in-law to get in the way. We'll be the most powerful couple in the city. Hosek's hand moved slowly toward the side of the console, his fingers grazing a burner phone. He could end this now. With one command, Marcus and his men would storm the room and erase these two from existence. But as he watched them clink their glasses together in a celebratory toast, a deeper, colder logic took hold. Death was too quick for this kind of betrayal. He wanted them to feel the walls closing in. He wanted Esther to believe she was winning, right up until the moment he pulled the world out from under her feet. "You're a genius, Esther," Julian whispered, leaning in to kiss her. "Hosek is a relic. He still talks about honor and protecting the family. He doesn't realize the world is run by people like us now, people who take what they want. He's a man who lives in the dark. He's so busy looking at his enemies on the outside that he forgot to look at who was sitting at his own dinner table." Hosek took a slow, deep breath, forcing his heart rate to steady. He didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. He felt the absolute sub-zero chill of a hunter who had found his prey. He reached out and adjusted the camera angle, zooming in on the signatures on the legal documents. He needed names. He needed every person involved in this plot: the doctor, the lawyer, the facility manager. "Enjoy your drink, Esther," Hosek whispered into the dark, empty room. "Enjoy the house while you can, because you aren't just losing my money, you're losing the only thing that kept you safe in this city." Suddenly, the monitor caught a movement in the hallway. Linda, the maid, was approaching the living room with a tray of tea, likely unaware that Esther had a guest. Hosek's eyes narrowed. He knew what Esther was like when she was performing for him, but he was about to see how she handled the invisible staff when she thought no one was watching. The plot for his money was one thing, but the safety of those under his roof was another. He settled back into his chair, the blue light of the screens reflecting the predator's gaze that made him the most feared man in the city.
The atmosphere in the surveillance room turned frigid as the monitor captured Linda Frank entering the living room. She was carrying a silver tray with a fresh pot of tea, and a plate of the soft biscuits Bora favored, her movements quiet and unassuming. She stopped dead when she saw Julian Vance lounging on the sofa, his hand draped over the back of Esther's neck. The tray trembled slightly in her grip, but she quickly lowered her gaze, trying to maintain the invisibility that usually protected her. I apologize, Miss Esther," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible through the high-sensitivity microphones. "I didn't know you had company. I was just bringing the tea for Madame Bora." Esther didn't just look annoyed, she looked possessed by a sudden, violent irritation. The presence of the maid was a reminder of the world she was trying to scrub away, a world where she had to play a role. She stood up, her yellow dress shimmering under the chandelier like the skin of a venomous snake. "Did I ask for tea, Linda?" Esther's voice was a jagged shard of glass. She walked toward the maid, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. "And why are you mentioning that woman? I told you she was resting. Or are you too stupid to follow a simple directive?" "Madame Bora was asking for her medicine, miss," Linda replied, her voice shaking but steady in its intent. "I thought it would be best if she had something in her stomach first." In the secret room, Hosek's breath hitched. He watched Esther reach out and violently swap the tray from Linda's hands. The porcelain shattered against the floor, hot tea splashing across the maid's white apron and the expensive rug. Linda didn't flinch from the heat. She only looked down at the mess with a hollow kind of despair.
"You're a clumsy, useless brat," Esther hissed. At that moment, the door to the hallway creaked open. Bora appeared, leaning heavily on her walker, her frame looking smaller and more fragile than Hosak had ever seen it. She had heard the crash and the shouting. Her eyes were wide with a confusion that quickly sharpened into fear as she took in the scene, the stranger on her sofa and the venom in her daughter-in-law's eyes. "Esther?" Bora's voice was thin, a mere thread of sound. "What is happening? Who is this man?" Esther turned, her face twisting into a mask of pure cruelty now that she no longer had to pretend. "Go back to your room, you old hag. Your son isn't here to protect you now, and I'm tired of your wandering eyes."
You shouldn't speak to me that way," Bora stammered, her hand trembling on the walker. "This is my son's house. I will tell Hosak." "You won't tell him anything," Esther shrieked. She lunged forward, her hand raised to strike the elderly woman. Before Esther's hand could connect, Linda moved. With a speed born of pure desperation and loyalty, the maid threw herself between the two women. She wrapped her arms around Bora, pulling the frail woman into her chest and turning her back to the attacker. Esther, fueled by a cocktail of greed and unchecked malice, didn't stop. Instead of a slap, she delivered a brutal driving kick aimed at the space where Bora had been standing. The heavy heel of her designer shoe slammed into Linda's ribs. The sound of the impact, a dull, sickening thud, echoed through the surveillance room speakers. Linda let out a choked gasp, her body doubling over, but she never let go of Bora. She lowered the elderly woman gently to the floor, shielding her with her own bruised form as they both collapsed onto the rug. Hosak surged out of his chair, his hand flying to the hidden latch of the library door. His vision went red, the tattoos on his neck pulsing as his blood pressure skyrocketed. He wanted to tear the door off its hinges. He wanted to feel Esther's throat beneath his boots. But as he gripped the handle, he saw Linda on the screen. Despite the pain clearly radiating through her body, despite the blood now trickling from a cut on her lip where she had struck the marble, Linda looked up at Esther with a gaze of absolute, unyielding defiance. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She simply tightened her hold on Bora, her body a human fortress against the monster in the yellow dress. "You will not touch her," Linda whispered, the words thick with blood but sharp with iron. Hosak froze, his hand trembling on the latch. He saw the maid, the woman he had looked past for years, standing as the only line of defense for the woman who gave him life. The fury was still there, a roaring fire in his chest, but it was joined by a new, profound sense of shame. He realized in that moment that his mother had been right. The real face of his house wasn't the one in the yellow dress. It was the one bleeding on the floor to save a woman who wasn't even her kin. He slowly pulled his hand back from the door, his jaw locking like a sound of grinding stone. He wouldn't end it yet. He would wait until the evidence was so absolute that there would be nowhere for Esther to hide. But the debt he owed the girl on the floor, that would be paid in full. The heavy silence of the surveillance room was broken only by Hosak's ragged, shallow breathing as he watched the aftermath of the violence. On the monitors, Esther and Julian had retreated to the other side of the room, their laughter echoing like the cackle of hyenas over a fresh kill. They were clinking glasses again, celebrating the unfortunate accident that would surely speed up Bora's relocation to the industrial warehouse they called a nursing home. But Hosak's eyes were locked on the floor. Linda Frank remained on her knees, her body still curved into a protective crescent around Bora. The maid's face was pale, and a dark bruise was already beginning to bloom along her jawline where she had struck the marble. Through the high-fidelity speakers, Hosak heard a low, rhythmic sound. It was Linda, whispering a song. It was a soft, soulful melody, a lullaby intended to drown out the harsh words of the monsters standing just feet away. With agonizing slowness, Linda began to move. Every shift of her weight brought a wince of pain to her features. The kick Esther had delivered to her ribs was clearly severe. Yet she didn't call out for help. She didn't complain. Her first priority was the trembling woman in her arms.
"It's all right, Mama Bora," Linda whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, but anchored by a strange, fierce strength. "I'm here. I've got you. The shadows can't hurt you while I'm standing guard." Hosak watched, mesmerized and humbled, as the girl he had traded as a ghost for 3 years performed a ritual of pure, unadulterated love. With one hand clutching her side, the other used to gently wipe the tears from wrinkled Bora's cheeks. She moved with the grace of a saint, ignoring the shattered porcelain and the tea-soaked rug that ruined her uniform. When Esther finally barked an order for them to get out of her sight, Linda didn't argue. She braced herself, her muscles straining, and managed to lift Bora back into her wheelchair. The effort sent a fresh jolt of pain through Linda's frame. Hosak saw her eyes flutter and her lips turn white, but she didn't let Bora slip. The scene shifted as Linda wheeled Bora back into the darkened sanctuary of the bedroom. The main lights were off, leaving the room bathed in the soft, amber glow of a single nightlight. Hosak switched the feed to the bedroom camera, his heart feeling like it was being squeezed by an iron fist.
Linda didn't just put Bora to bed. She spent the next hour tending to the woman with a level of detail that Hosak realized he had never provided himself. Despite her own injuries, Linda knelt on the floor to massage Bora's cramped legs. She fetched a warm basin of water and gently washed the older woman's hands, whispering stories about the stars to distract her from the trauma of the living room. Then, Linda did something that finally broke the last of Hosak's cold exterior. Thinking she was completely alone in the shadows, Linda sat on the edge of the bed and leaned her head against Bora's hand. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph of a young boy in a hospital gown. She kissed the photo, her shoulders finally shaking with the weight of the day's cruelty. "Just a little longer, Daniel," she sobbed silently, her voice a ghost of a sound. "I'll bear it all. I'll take every hit, every insult, as long as I can keep this job. I won't let them stop your treatment. I promise." Hosak leaned back in his chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off a single, solitary tear that tracked through the stubble on his cheek. He had spent his life believing that power was found in the barrel of a gun or the size of a bank account. He had looked at Linda Frank and seen a servant, a girl with no name and no status. Now he saw the truth. He saw a warrior. He saw a woman who was enduring the fires of hell to protect his mother and save her own brother, while the woman he had chosen to marry was stoking the flames. The contrast was so sharp it was blinding. Linda Frank was the soul of his house, and he had been too blind to see it. "You've done enough, Linda," Hosak whispered into the dark of the secret room, his voice raspy with a new kind of resolve. "You won't have to take another hit for us, not ever again." He reached for the control panel, his fingers hovering over the command to call Marcus. He wanted to tell his men to prepare the safe house, not for his mother, but for Linda's brother. He wanted to move, to act, to punish, but he forced himself to wait. He needed to hear that phone call. He needed to know exactly who was helping Esther destroy his family, so that when he finally stepped out of the shadows, there would be no one left to stand in his way. For the first time in 17 years, Hosak Nari wasn't fighting for an empire. He was fighting for the two women who had shown him what loyalty actually looked like. The stillness of the secret room was absolute, yet the air felt heavy with the lingering echo of Linda's quiet sobs. Hosak sat frozen, his gaze fixed on the monitor where the maid had finally fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep in a chair beside his mother's bed. He looked at the small, crumpled photograph she had left on the nightstand, the image of a boy whose eyes were too large for his sunken, pale face. A sharp digital chirp broke the silence. Hosak's pulse spiked. It was the signal that a restricted line within the house had been activated. He quickly tapped the console, routing the audio through his headset. He expected to hear Esther's jagged, cruel voice plotting with Julian again. Instead, he heard the frantic, rhythmic beep of a hospital corridor and the heavy, ragged breathing of someone trying to stay composed. It was Linda,
She had moved to the darkened kitchen, her voice a desperate whisper that barely carried over the hum of the industrial refrigerators. "Dr. Aris? Please, tell me you have good news," she pleaded. A weary, clinical voice responded on the other end. "Linda, I'm sorry. We've reached the limit. Daniel's latest labs show he's entering stage 5 renal failure. If he doesn't get the transplant within the month, his body won't be strong enough to survive the surgery, even if a donor appears."
Hosiak felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. He watched Linda on the screen. She was leaning against the cold marble countertop, her hand pressed hard against the ribs where Esther had kicked her. "I have the money for this month's dialysis," Linda whispered, her voice cracking. "I've been working extra shifts. I've taken every hit. Just don't take him off the list, please." "It's not just the money anymore, Linda," the doctor sighed. "The private donor list requires a massive deposit up front to secure a match. Without that fast-track fee, he's just a name at the bottom of a 1,000-page ledger. I know how hard you're working at the Nari estate, but the amount they're asking for, even a year's salary, wouldn't cover the down payment." Linda's shoulders shook, a single choked sound escaping her throat. "I'll find it. I'll do whatever it takes. If I have to sell my blood, if I have to work until I drop, he's all I have left." Hosiak's hand hovered over the screen, his fingers inches away from the image of Linda's tear-streaked face. For 17 years, he had operated in a world where money was a weapon, used to buy loyalty or silence enemies. He had spent millions on luxury cars for ungrateful managers and diamonds for a woman who was currently planning his murder. Yet here, in the heart of his own home, a girl was literally bleeding for a fraction of what he spent on a single dinner. The doctor's voice softened. "There's one more thing. I received a call today from an anonymous representative asking about Daniel's status. They claim to be calling on behalf of your employer, a Miss Chidi. She told the hospital that your employment was being terminated due to theft and that the support you claimed to have from the Nari family was a lie." Linda's knees buckled. She slid down the side of the cabinets, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Theft? I've never touched a cent that wasn't mine. She's trying to kill him." "If your employment is terminated and the accusations are made official, the hospital's ethics board will have to remove him from the priority list. I'm sorry, Linda. You need to fix this by tomorrow morning, or I won't be able to stop the paperwork." The line went dead. Linda stayed on the floor, her head buried in her knees. The silence of the kitchen was deafening, but in the secret room, Hosiak Nari's world was exploding. The fury he had felt when Esther kicked Linda was nothing compared to the cold, murderous fire that now consumed his soul. Esther wasn't just a con artist, she was a predator who hunted the most vulnerable. She was using a dying boy as a bargaining chip to keep her crimes hidden. Hosiak's hand hovered over the screen, his fingers inches away from the image of Linda's tear-streaked face. For 17 years, he had operated in a world where money was a weapon, used to buy loyalty or silence enemies. He had spent millions on luxury cars for ungrateful managers and diamonds for a woman who was currently planning his murder. Yet here, in the heart of his own home, a girl was literally bleeding for a fraction of what he spent on a single dinner. The doctor's voice softened. "There's one more thing. I received a call today from an anonymous representative asking about Daniel's status. They claim to be calling on behalf of your employer, a Miss Chidi. She told the hospital that your employment was being terminated due to theft and that the support you claimed to have from the Nari family was a lie." Linda's knees buckled. She slid down the side of the cabinets, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Theft? I've never touched a cent that wasn't mine. She's trying to kill him."
If your employment is terminated and the accusations are made official, the hospital's ethics board will have to remove him from the priority list. I'm sorry, Linda. You need to fix this by tomorrow morning, or I won't be able to stop the paperwork. The line went dead. Linda stayed on the floor, her head buried in her knees. The silence of the kitchen was deafening, but in the secret room, Hosiak Nari's world was exploding.
"I'm here, boss," the voice responded instantly. "I need the best renal specialist on the East Coast at St. Jude's Hospital within the hour. Tell them Daniel Frank is now under the personal protection of the Nari family. Every debt, every fee, every cent of that transplant, it's handled. If a single person mentions the word termination or theft regarding his sister, they answer to me personally." "Understood. And the donor?" Hosiak looked back at the screen, watching Linda slowly pick herself up to go check on his mother one last time before the sun rose. "Find the match. I don't care what it costs. If money can buy a life, then tonight money is going to be the only thing that saves Esther Chidi from what I really want to do to her." He ended the call and leaned back into the shadows. The test was over. He had seen the heart of a monster and the soul of a saint. Now it was time for the ghost of the mansion to start making his presence felt. Esther Chidi thought she was playing a game of chess, but she didn't realize she was sitting across from a man who had already flipped the board. The blue light of the surveillance monitors cast long flickering shadows against the back wall of the secret room, making Hosiak's features look like they were carved from granite. His attention was diverted from the live feed of the kitchen by the sharp vibration of his secure tablet. A message had arrived from Marcus, marked with the highest level of priority. It contained a single file, a death certificate from a small provincial hospital in West Africa, dated 5 years ago. Hosiak swiped through the documents, his eyes narrowing as he read the name on the certificate, Esther Chidi. His heart didn't race, it slowed to a predatory crawl. He looked at the high-resolution photo attached to the file, the real Esther. She was a woman of grace, yes, but her features bore no resemblance to the woman currently sleeping in his guest wing. The real Esther had died of a sudden illness years before she was ever supposed to have met him in London. A second file appeared, a facial recognition match from an Interpol database. The woman in his house wasn't a socialite or the daughter of an elite business dynasty. Her real name was Amara Miller, a professional con artist wanted on 3 continents for honey trap liquidations of wealthy estates. She was a ghost, a chameleon who specialized in finding powerful men with vulnerable family members, infiltrating their lives and draining their empires before disappearing into the mist. Hosiak leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. The depth of the deception was breathtaking. Amara hadn't just lied about her love for him, she had stolen a life, a name, and a history. She had spent months studying his family, learning his mother's favorite tea, and practicing the perfect sweet smile to disarm a man who was famous for being impossible to fool. "You're a masterpiece, Amara," Hosiak whispered to the empty room, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "A work of art made entirely of glass and poison." He realized now why she was so desperate to isolate Bora. His mother, even in her confused state, was the only one whose instinct had pierced the veil. Bora hadn't seen a fiancé, she had seen a predator. And that was why Amara needed her gone. If Bora was declared incompetent, there would be no one left to question the history Amara had fabricated. A third document caught his eye, a list of financial transfers. Amara wasn't working alone. She had been funneling small, undetectable amounts of Nari capital into offshore accounts for months, but the destination wasn't just Julian Vance's pockets. The money was being used to fund a private security firm, one that specialized in extractions. She wasn't just planning to marry him for his money, she was planning to have him eliminated the moment the ink was dry on the marriage certificate, using his own money to pay for the hit.
Hosiak's hand moved to the console, pulling up the history of his own security logs. He saw where she had bypassed the encryption, where she had planted bugs in his private office, and how she had systematically replaced his loyal staff with her own recommended hires, like the corrupt doctor she had called to blackmail Linda. The fury that had been a roaring fire earlier now distilled into something much more dangerous, a cold, calculating resolve. He looked back at the monitor where Linda was still resting. The contrast was now absolute. On one side of the house sat a woman who had stolen a dead girl's name to destroy a family. On the other sat a woman who was willing to die to protect a mother that wasn't hers. Hosiak tapped a command, sending a message to Marcus. The bride is a ghost. The wedding is still on. I want the guest list expanded. Invite the real Chidi family's legal representatives. Invite the press. And Marcus, tell the hospital to prepare a private suite for a VIP guest tonight. Linda Frank's brother Daniel is moving. He watched Amara on the screen, seeing her through the lens of the truth for the first time. Every move she made, every hair she tucked behind her ear was a calculated lie. She thought she was the one holding the strings, but she didn't realize she was standing in a room full of cameras, being watched by a man who had made a career out of making ghosts stay dead. Enjoy the dream, Amara, Hosiak said, his eyes glowing with a lethal light. Because when you wake up, you're going to realize that the man you tried to con is the one who owns the nightmare. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the Nari mansion, but for Linda Frank, the light brought no warmth. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her body aching from the previous night's assault, her hand instinctively hovering over her bruised ribs. She was exhausted, but the fear for her brother Daniel was a cold weight in her chest that kept her upright. She didn't hear Esther, or rather Amara, approach. The woman moved with the silent grace of a predator, her footsteps muffled by the expensive rug. When Linda turned, she gasped, seeing the woman in the yellow dress standing just inches away, her eyes cold and predatory.
"You look tired, Linda," Esther said, her voice dripping with a mock sympathy that made Linda's skin crawl. "I imagine it's hard to sleep when you're busy being a martyr for a woman who barely knows your name." "I was just preparing Madame Bora's breakfast, miss," Linda replied, her voice trembling as she lowered her head. Esther stepped closer, her perfume cloying and thick. She reached out, using a single finger to lift Linda's chin, forcing the maid to look into her eyes. "I spoke to the hospital this morning. It seems there's been some confusion regarding your status here. I told them that a significant amount of jewelry has gone missing from my chambers. I told them I suspect the humble little maid who has been far too close to the family assets." Linda's heart skipped a beat. "I've never stolen anything. You know that isn't true." "It doesn't matter if it's true," hissed Esther, her face contorting into the mask of the monster Hosiak had seen on the monitors. "It only matters what I say, and right now, I'm saying that you are a thief. If I make that call official, you won't just lose this job. I will personally see to it that you are blackballed from every hospital, agency, and private home in this city. You'll never work as a caregiver again. And we both know what that means for your brother, don't we?" Linda felt the world tilt. "Please, Daniel needs that transplant. He'll die without it. I'll do anything. I'll leave. I'll never speak to Hosiak." "Oh, you'll stay," Esther interrupted, a cruel smile spreading across her lips. "You'll stay and you'll keep your mouth shut about everything you saw last night. You will be my silent little ghost. If I hear one word of complaint from Bora, or if I see you looking at Hosiak with those pathetic, pleading eyes when he returns, I will pull the plug on your brother myself. I have friends at that hospital, Linda.
One accidental power surge, one clogged dialysis line, and Daniel becomes just another tragic statistic. In the darkness of the secret room, Hoseok Nari's knuckles cracked as he gripped the armrests of his chair. He watched as Linda sank to her knees, her spirit finally breaking under the weight of the woman's malice. Through the speakers, he heard Linda's ragged, broken sob, a sound of pure, helpless agony. "I promise," Linda whispered, her forehead touching the cold marble floor. "I'll be quiet. Just please, save my brother." Esther laughed, a sharp, tittering sound that echoed through the house. "Good girl. Now clean up this kitchen. You're late with the tray." As Esther swept out of the room, her yellow dress billowing behind her like a flame, Hoseok leaned back into the shadows. His face was a mask of absolute lethal calm. He had seen the ultimate blackmail. He had seen a woman use a dying child as a weapon to enslave a saint. He reached out and tapped a command on his console, opening a secure channel to his head of security. "Marcus," Hoseok said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Change of plans. We aren't waiting for the wedding dinner. I want the specialist at the hospital to move Daniel to the private wing now and tell our fiancée that I'm arriving home early. I want to see the look on her face when the fool she's been mocking walks through the front door." Hoseok watched the screen as Linda slowly dragged herself up from the floor, wiping her eyes with her blood-stained apron to go serve the woman who was trying to destroy her. The debt was growing by the hour, and Hoseok Nari was a man who always paid his debts with interest. He stood up, his tall frame casting a massive shadow over the monitors. The observation was over. The hunt had begun. The roar of the motorcade's engines announced Hoseok Nari's return long before the black SUVs breached the mansion's iron gates. Inside the secret room, Hoseok watched the monitors one last time as Esther, or rather Amara, instantly transformed. She dropped the glass of expensive scotch she had been sharing with Julian and scrambled to the mirror, smoothing her hair and adjusting her features back into the mask of the grieving, devoted fiancé. Julian disappeared through the service entrance with the practiced ease of a thief, and for a moment the house looked as peaceful as a grave. Hoseok stepped out of the library's hidden wall, the cool, recycled air of the surveillance room replaced by the suffocating scent of jasmine perfume and hidden rot. He walked toward the front door just as his lead car pulled into the driveway. When the massive oak door swung open, Amara was there, her eyes welling with artificial tears of joy. She threw herself at him, her arms wrapping around his neck with a desperation that would have fooled him only hours ago. "Hoseok, you're back early. I was still worried. The news said there were storms over the Atlantic." Hoseok didn't pull away. He allowed her to embrace him, but his body was as rigid as a statue. He felt the phantom weight of the bruises on Linda's ribs and the cold reality of the medical reports in his pocket. "The storms cleared faster than expected," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a visible shiver down her spine. "I found I couldn't stand to be away from my family for another second." "I've missed you so much," she whispered, pulling back to look at him with that practiced, shimmering gaze. "The house has been so quiet without you. Just me, your mother, and the help." "Is that so?" Hoseok's eyes scanned the foyer, landing on Linda, who stood in the shadows of the dining room archway. Her head was bowed, her posture defensive, and a dark, poorly concealed bruise marked the side of her jaw. When her eyes met Hoseok's, she saw a flash of pure, unadulterated terror. She was looking at him, then at Amara, remembering the threat against her brother. "Linda," Hoseok said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Come here."
The maid approached with trembling steps. Amara's smile tightened, her eyes flashing a silent, lethal warning at the girl. "She's been a bit clumsy while you were away, darling, tripped over her own feet in the kitchen. I've had to be quite firm with her about her performance." Hosak reached out, his gloved hand moving toward Linda's face. Amara held her breath, expecting a strike. Instead, Hosak gently tilted Linda's chin up, forcing her to look him in the eye. He didn't say a word, but in that moment he allowed the wolf to show in his gaze, not for the maid, but for the monster standing beside him. He saw the flicker of confusion in Linda's eyes, the moment she realized he wasn't looking at her with the coldness of a master, but with the intensity of a witness. "Clean yourself up, Linda," he said quietly, "and tell the kitchen to prepare a full dinner. Tonight is a celebration. I want everyone at the table, even my mother." Amara's face paled. "Hosak, Bora has been so unwell. The doctor said she needs absolute rest. Perhaps it's best if we just—"
"I didn't ask for a medical opinion, Esther," he snapped, using her stolen name with a bite that made her flinch. "I want my family together, now." The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The long mahogany table was set with silver and crystal, reflecting the flickering candlelight. Bora sat at the foot of the table, her hands shaking as she clutched a lace handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously toward Amara. Linda stood at the sideboard, serving the wine with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Hosak sat at the head, the apex predator in his own hall. He watched Amara play her part, laughing at his stories and leaning in to touch his arm, all while he felt the folder in his jacket pocket, the death certificate of the real Esther Chidi. "You know, Esther," Hosak said, swirling a deep red vintage in his glass, "I spent a lot of time thinking about loyalty while I was away, about how easy it is to wear a mask when the sun is out, and how quickly people show their true teeth when they think they're in the dark." Amara's fork clattered against her plate. "What a strange thing to say, darling. Is everything all right with the Sicilian deal?" "The deal is perfect," Hosak replied, his eyes locking onto hers with a lethal, predatory stillness. "But I found that I left a few loose ends here at home, secrets that have been rotting in the walls." He turned his gaze toward Linda, then back to Amara. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a physical weight, a suffocating pressure before the strike. Amara tried to laugh, but it died in her throat as she saw Hosak reach into his pocket and pull out a small, crumpled photograph, the one Linda had been crying over in the dark. "I found this in the kitchen," Hosak said, sliding the photo across the table toward Amara. "Such a brave little boy. It would be a shame if anything happened to his treatment, wouldn't it?" Amara's eyes widened. She thought he was playing her game, that he was threatening the maid alongside her. She smiled, a small, triumphant curve of her lips. "Yes, it would be a tragedy." Hosak leaned forward, the candlelight carving his face into terrifying shadows. "The tragedy, Amara, is that you thought you were the only one watching the screens." The silence that followed was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Amara's smile froze, her blood turning to ice as she realized the wolf hadn't just come home, he had never left. The dining room was a tomb of silence, the only sound the flickering of the candles and the ragged, uneven breathing of the woman Hosak now knew as Amara Miller. She stared at the photograph of Daniel, her mind racing to reconcile how the fool she had been mocking possessed the one thing that was supposed to be her secret leverage. "I thought tonight we should look back at our journey, Esther," Hosak said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "A tribute to the woman who is about to join the Nari legacy. Something to remind us all of what matters most, family."
He tapped a button on his smartphone. Across the room, a large, hidden projector screen descended with a mechanical hum, covering the gold leaf wallpaper. Amara forced a shaky laugh, her fingers digging into the tablecloth. "Hey, Suck, darling, really? It's just the four of us. We don't need a presentation." "Oh, I think we do," Hosuk replied, his eyes never leaving hers, "because I saw things while I was away that I never want to forget." The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a montage of their engagement photos or high society galas. It was the grainy, high-angle footage from the living room 2 nights ago. Amara's breath hitched as she saw herself on the screen, her face twisted in a mask of unhinged rage, the yellow dress looking like a jaundiced stain on the marble. The room watched in visceral detail as Amara swatted the tray from Linda's hands. Then the kick. The dull thud of the impact through the speakers made Bora sob into her lace handkerchief. Hosok watched the screen as Linda threw herself over his mother, taking the blow that was meant for the woman who gave him life. On the screen, Amara's voice rang out, cold and predatory. "Go back to your room, you old hag. Your son isn't here to protect you now." Amara surged to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is a fabrication, a deepfake. Hosok, you can't believe." "Sit down, Amara," Hosok roared, the sheer power of his voice making the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. She froze. The use of her real name acted like a physical blow, stripping away the last of her stolen identity. Hosok stood up, pulling a folder from his jacket and tossing it onto the table. It slid across the wood, spilling out the death certificate of the real Esther Chidi and the Interpol files detailing Amara's history of blood-soaked cons. The real Esther Chidi died 5 years ago in a provincial hospital, Hosok said, walking slowly around the table toward her. "You didn't just lie to me. You brought violence into my home. You threatened a dying boy to silence a woman whose shadow you aren't fit to walk in." Amara surged to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is a fabrication, a deepfake. Hosok, you can't believe." "Sit down, Amara." Hosok roared, the sheer power of his voice making the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. She froze. The use of her real name acted like a physical blow, stripping away the last of her stolen identity. Hosok stood up, pulling a folder from his jacket and tossing it onto the table. It slid across the wood, spilling out the death certificate of the real Esther Chidi and the Interpol files detailing Amara's history of blood-soaked cons. The real Esther Chidi died 5 years ago in a provincial hospital, Hosok said, walking slowly around the table toward her. "You didn't just lie to me. You brought violence into my home. You threatened a dying boy to silence a woman whose shadow you aren't fit to walk in." Amara surged to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is a fabrication, a deepfake. Hosok, you can't believe." "Sit down, Amara." Hosok roared, the sheer power of his voice making the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. She froze. The use of her real name acted like a physical blow, stripping away the last of her stolen identity. Hosok stood up, pulling a folder from his jacket and tossing it onto the table. It slid across the wood, spilling out the death certificate of the real Esther Chidi and the Interpol files detailing Amara's history of blood-soaked cons. The real Esther Chidi died 5 years ago in a provincial hospital, Hosok said, walking slowly around the table toward her. "You didn't just lie to me. You brought violence into my home. You threatened a dying boy to silence a woman whose shadow you aren't fit to walk in." Amara looked toward the door, her eyes darting like a trapped animal, but Marcus and 2 other men appeared in the shadows, their expressions as cold as the winter night. She looked back at Hosok, her face finally losing all pretense of beauty, replaced by the jagged, ugly desperation of a caught thief. I did what I had to do, she shrieked. You're a monster, Hosak. You think you're better than me? You built this house on blood. I built this house to protect my own, Hosak said, now standing inches from her. And you made the mistake of thinking my mother's vulnerability was a weakness. You thought Linda's silence was fear, but I've spent my life in the dark, and I know the difference between a predator and a protector. He turned away from her as if she were nothing more than a piece of trash to be discarded. Marcus, take her. Hand her over to the families of the men she's robbed. Let them decide what a ghost is worth. And Julian Vance, tell his father that if I see a member of his bloodline in this city by sunrise, I will consider it an act of war. As Amara was dragged out, screaming curses that faded into the depths of the mansion, the room fell into a profound, healing silence. Hosak walked over to his mother, kissing her forehead. It's over, Mother. The snake is gone. Finally, Hosak turned to Linda. The maid was standing by the sideboard, her tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching her apron. She looked at him with a mix of shock and hope, her body still trembling from the months of terror she had endured in silence. Hosak walked to her, and for the first time in his life, he lowered his head in a gesture of absolute respect to someone outside his bloodline. "Linda," he said softly, "while I was busy looking for a queen in the high-rises and ballrooms, I was blind to the one who was already guarding my home. You bled for my mother. You stood when I was too far away to protect her." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the calluses she had earned serving his family. "Daniel has been moved to a private suite at St. Jude's. The donor has been found, and the surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. You will never have to work another day in your life unless it is by choice. From this moment on, you are no longer a servant in this house. You are a member of the Nari family. This home is as much yours as it is mine." Linda couldn't speak. She simply leaned her forehead against his arm, her sobs turning from pain to a deep, soul-cleansing relief. Bora reached out from her wheelchair, taking Linda's other hand and pulling her close. Hosak looked out at the city lights through the window, the blue glow of the monitors in the other room finally extinguished. He had started this as a test of a fiancé's mask, but he had ended it by finding a heart of pure gold. In a world of shadows and betrayal, he had finally learned that the truest power wasn't found in who you could destroy, but in who was brave enough to stand in the way of the blow. The wolf had found his peace, and the House of Nari finally had a heart.